Hey everyone, a quick announcement before we dive in. The React Native show is transforming into React Universe on air in a few weeks. React Native will still be very much on our radar, but we're expanding our horizons to embrace all things cross-platform and full stack, from React Native to React. While the name is changing, our exceptional content remains, featuring insights from tech creators and innovators. So buckle up and get ready to explore the React Universe with us. Let's get started.
Welcome to the React Native Show podcast, brought to you by Callstack, the total software engineering consultancy. My name is Ola Desmurs-Linczewska. I've been a guest here a couple of times. This is the first time I'm hosting, so I'm a little bit stressed, but I'm also super excited because today we'll be talking security with an awesome guest, Peter Fernandez, Principal Developer Advocate at Okta. Peter, would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, thank you very much. I loved the introduction. I'm an awesome guest. I love that. Thank you. And I am so happy to be here on your inaugural outing as a host as well. My inaugural time on the podcast. And so I'm Peter Fernandez, as you said, Principal Developer Advocate for Auth0, actually, by Okta. So I'm Okta and Auth0. Well, they're same family, but I concentrate on the Auth0 product. And well, I've been in the software industry for, my usual phrase is more years than I care to remember, but it's a number that's quite large. And I've been working at Auth0 and with the Auth0 product for over 6 years. So I like to think I know a little bit about what I'm talking about.
No, just a tiny little bit. So we'll get into that. We'll be focusing on authentication and authorization, and we'll be doing 2 episodes since the topics are so broad. We will first focus solely on authentication in this episode, and then we'll record another episode about authorization. And it feels like often people confuse the two because they sort of sound the same, but I really like the motto on Okta's website. I have it noted here. It's secure access for everyone, but not just anyone. So that's like today, like in this episode, we'll be focusing on this first part, secure access for everyone. So yeah, hopefully by the end of this episode, all our listeners will be able to every time pinpoint what authentication is versus authorization. But
if I do my job well, then hopefully that's okay.
For sure. I mean, we're both inaugurating this in the best possible way. So let's go. Let's start with a little bit of history. Like you mentioned, you've been in the industry for a while. I checked out your LinkedIn. You started working in 1987. So the landscape has changed a little bit. Can you do a rough, maybe take us on memory lane a little bit of what it was like as far as authentication, or maybe even your experience? Can you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, sure. You just mentioning that I started work in 1987, that's taking me back somewhat. So let's go back there. I'll start with my experience getting into the industry to start with, because a lot of people, I think, they often ask the question, how do you get into the industry? And I started back in the 80s. I was a kind of, the 80s were my informative years, basically. That was my teenage years. And I grew up effectively with the first set of home computers that came along. So things like the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, Commodore 64, all of those things. And being in the UK, we were
out of the 3 you mentioned, I remember Commodore 64, so that's at least one.
Oh, there you go. So, and do you know what? It was that was a time when you kind of had your favorites. You know, some people were the Commodore 64 aficionados, some people were the Spectrum aficionados, and I had a ZX81 actually, that's what I started with, and that was the kind of precursor to the ZX Spectrum. 1K RAM it came with, and you had a 16K RAM pack that you could put in.
And you had that at home.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. In fact, it started at school. And the school, the college that I was at the time, Well, it would have been school, so it was kind of pre-college, but we got a grant from the government or something to get kind of personal computers. And I started playing around with this ZX Spectrum, well, ZX81 as it was at school. And then I thought, I'd really like to get one of these. So I did the usual thing, convinced my parents that I needed one and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, of course.
And I remember ordering it. And I ordered it from, there was an article and an order form in a newspaper, and you filled it in and you sent it off to Sinclair Research. Yeah. This is how it worked. You sent it off to Sinclair Research, and I think it was £99.99. That was that. So £99.99. I think that's what it was back then, which back then was a lot of money. And somebody wrote me a check. I think it was one of my parents who wrote me a check. We sent it, posted it, away it went. And it was for more than $99.99 because I also bought the 16K RAM pack.
Okay.
So that used to go in the back. I gave you, well, it extended it in total to 16K. And I remember that the RAM pack arrived first. And then 3 weeks later, the computer arrived. So I couldn't do anything with this RAM. So I had this RAM pack, and I would take it out like every day and look at it. Oh, RAM pack.
Oh, my precious.
Yeah, it was. It was just like that. And it was like, I put it back in a box and everything else. And eventually my ZX81 came. And then I obviously started BASIC. And I learned via school and via somebody one of the teachers actually, who was kind of did the equivalent of what would have been a computer studies class. But in those days, computer studies classes didn't really exist at that time in a school. They were in universities and stuff like that, but at that time in the school, they didn't really exist. And computers were first brought in as part of the science department. So this was a lab technician that worked in the science department, and he'd done a kind of course in basic programming at what was then Bristol Polytechnic, is now Bristol University or University of Bristol, here in the UK. And it was Bristol Polytechnic. He'd done a course in BASIC. He showed me how to write BASIC. And he also got me into like learning about how this basic program actually worked on the hardware itself. So to cut a long story short,
very, very, very low level stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I taught myself Z80 assembler, because that was the microprocessor at the time in the ZX81. And it was kind of a double-edged sword because I didn't really go to many of my other classes that I was supposed to go to. And when the teachers used to try and hunt me down, they'd always go, look for him in the lab. And there I would be in the lab playing around with this stuff.
I was just about to ask how your parents viewed this experience. Like you dove deep into computers. Were they happy about it? Are they happy now?
They're happy now. I'm not sure. There was very divided opinion at the time. Let's put it that way.
But they're happy now, so that's good.
They're happy now, so that's okay. And so anyway, like over the years, I played more around with hardware. I got into more programming languages. I learned C. I learned C++, and essentially, I came from a position really where I got to play with everything that was part of a computer system. We didn't have modern operating systems back in the day, and guess what? We didn't have either. We didn't have very much security either back in the day. We didn't need it really. So along came effectively IBM PC, and once the IBM PC came along, and we had kind of in the Intel series processors, starting with the 8088, 8086, all the way through there. Computers became more ubiquitous. And effectively what happened was that this notion of the personal computer that IBM said would never take off, everything's going to be mainframe and everything else like that, it suddenly exploded. Now, over in the world of mainframes, they had security for some time. So I actually found out somewhat later on in my career with the second job I actually worked for, which was actually a mainframe shop. They actually wrote software for mainframes, and that got me into things like RACF and ACF2 and Top Secret and stuff like that. And those programs back in the day that were all about security on the mainframe. And from a authentication point of view, this episode's on authentication, so we'll keep it on authentication for the moment. But from an authentication point of view, they were all about user ID and password. Me eventually entering my credentials into some dialog box on the screen, and it was 3270 terminals back in the day for mainframes, and PCs were like a novelty because they had these rich, effectively intelligent terminals that you could kind of interact with. Back in the day on the mainframe, very much different, very kind of like, no color, phosphor, green or orange displays. And so like the easiest thing to use was a user ID and password because you didn't have the ability to do biometrics or anything like that. So user ID and password was the authentication mechanism. And it was fairly straightforward. You typed in a user ID, you typed in a password somewhere in the mainframe. Exactly, somewhere in the mainframe, which was all back end. It would check stuff and it would effectively say, yep, you're allowed, or no, you're not. And this translated over to essentially the personal computer. So we use that model in the world of personal computers. And for a long time, user ID and password was essentially the way to go. You just needed a user ID and you just needed a password, and kind of off you popped, and everything was fine.
As we both know, the world has become much, much more complex today.
Yes. Well, exactly. So
many complexities. So let's try and talk a little bit about those current complexities, like the current landscape that we have for authentication. Because as you said, we start with just a box, user, password, but now there are so many things that should be considered. For example, when you're doing authentication, you have to start by who is the authentication for? Is it like business to client, or is it business to business? Or there are even more. I think there are more types, right, of authentication?
Yeah, there's actually, in the world of authentication, there's quite a lot of different types. So like kind of harking back to that previous conversation, when we got all these computers and the world of distributed computing exploded, we suddenly found ourselves in a situation where, well, a number of things happened, right? So user ID and password became still ubiquitous. We still use it even today. But the landscape from a perspective of security and effectively who was maybe attacking us or the threats in a distributed computer system, that became much more complex. And user ID and passwords were effectively, they weren't good from that perspective. But to go to what you were talking about in terms of, and sorry, I speak a lot with my hands, so I apologize for that.
That's okay.
To the audience and everybody, everything else. But in these distributed systems, we effectively started to build this idea of something as a service. So I won't say gone, but instead of having to build everything ourselves, we could leverage other services that other vendors and maybe other software writers and essentially other producers would effectively make. And we could use those and incorporate those into our software. And what that did was open up this notion of the fact that, well, I don't want to have to authenticate to every single one of those services when I use it. What I want to do is effectively leverage something that we in the industry called single sign. We sign in once and we can use that kind of verification of our credentials across these multiple platforms. And once that started to happen, what we effectively got was this need for, well, allowing that information about an authenticated user to be shared in a way that, well, one went beyond just user ID and passwords. So that changed the landscape. And then, as you mentioned, effectively what happened was that, well, we had these models, these different business models came about. So B2C business models, that's where I, as a consumer, will go use a software application, provide my credentials, etc., and away I go, so that the application knows that I am who I say that I am. But then there became these B2B business models where vendors could sell software applications to businesses, and then essentially employees and contractors and everything else within those businesses could effectively use those applications. And when I'm working in that environment, I will normally log onto my computer, and I don't ever want to have to put credentials in somewhere else again. So that idea of SSO became even more important. So this is how the landscape changed. And you mentioned that there are multiple different models. We have B2C and B2B and B2B2C and B2B2B, and those are all, and B2E, a B2E as well, yeah, B2E models as well. And those are all user authentic. B2E. So B2E is essentially business to enterprise. It's effectively, it's effectively where an organization will essentially build its own applications, and those applications are used internally. It's a subtle difference from B2B, where you're using someone else's application. Take, for instance, somebody like, we use, like at Okta, we use essentially travel management software and expense management software that's provided by a third party. So we don't build it internally. We're leveraging it by a third party. That's B2B. But we also build systems internally, and we use our own platform, what we call Okta Workforce, to actually provide B2E scenarios as well. So whereas we as employees are using our own internal systems, we log into those. So when those sort of models kind of like came about, and we have them today, and they're very prolific, they're all user authentication models. There's also a whole area of authentication to deal with what's called machine authentication. And that's essentially authentication in a non-user context. That's where, if I've got something like a back-end service, maybe a monitoring service, or maybe some sort of periodic kind of like processing service that kicks off in the background, then this notion of being able to authenticate not as me, but as the actual computer to a different endpoint, a different service. I'll come on to endpoints a bit more in a second, but to a different service and authenticate to a different service, not as me, the user, but as the computer itself, then that is a notion. That notion started with Active Directory, basically. Well, in fact, it started with Microsoft networking in general. The idea that computers could come together to form a network, and they would literally talk to each other to make sure that they were allowed to work in that network context.
Understandably, at this point, username and password is not enough, because you cannot expect computers to exchange username and password and just say, yeah, okay, we're good. So that's when we also see like a plethora of other types of authentication that can be done between machines, and also the birth of different types of authentication that can be done by users. Like you mentioned, SSO. So let's real quick, that's an acronym for a single sign-on. That's when you sign once, right? And then you have access to all types of applications. There's also social authentication for users who don't want to put in their username and password. Now we just trust the little Facebook or Twitter button or whatever it is. How about authenticating on different devices? Like I work on mobile applications. So what types would you recommend of authentication would you recommend for mobile apps?
So you can use all of those that you've just mentioned. Well, the social authentication, the user ID, password authentication, and you can use those on mobile applications as well. I think what we're most familiar with as users is biometric authentication. And that's essentially where I'll hold my mobile phone up to my face, or I'll touch the fingerprint reader, and it automatically authenticates me. So you're right about the different types of authentication models, and they're all about convenience. Authentication is a balance between convenience from a user's perspective and security from the perspective of not just protecting a system, but more importantly, and I think more valuably, protecting you as a user and your data. Because that's the thing that, well, we all read about and we all hear about in various kind of articles and the press and stuff like that about how systems get hacked, and it's our data that gets lost. And that becomes a real, data's like gold, especially from the perspective of the threat actors. So threat actor is a term that essentially gets used a lot for somebody who wants to, well, do something that's not quite right with either your data or convince you to effectively do something that you shouldn't be doing, like handing over all your cash for no apparent reason. So, threat actors are very much out there. They're very much present, and they want your data. So, yeah, going back to your question on a mobile device, anything that you can do that's secure and safe, but also convenient, is the way forward, essentially. And there's a new kid on the block. I don't know if you've heard much about it, but the new kid on the block is called passkeys. And passkeys are a passwordless credential that's essentially, it leverages cryptography and cryptographic algorithms that have been around for donkey's years, but it's all about trying to.
But now that Apple implements it's all new. It could be for years.
Definitely.
Apple has it. It's all shiny and nice.
There's a really interesting thing that I've come across is that technology goes in cycles, and it's normally every 10 years. It's a bit like Moore's Law. I don't know if you've ever heard of Moore's Law, but Moore's Law was essentially Intel based their entire company on Moore's Law, which for many years held true, and it was the computing power would essentially double every 6 to 12 months. It was normally every 12 months, right? And we eventually got to a threshold where the technology that we have today can't get any smaller, and it's too much heat, and that doesn't work anymore. But Intel based their entire company on Moore's Law. But essentially, I've lost my train of thought. I can't even remember what I was saying about with Moore's Law.
I was saying we were talking about cycles in technology that
that's right.
We've had cryptography for a while now, but now that Apple put it on their phones, we all clap and say yay.
Every 10 years, right? We reuse software and we reuse architecture. Pretty much every 10 years, we give it a different polish. Apple put a new face on it, make it pretty and shiny, and we all go, whoa, new thing. But it's a progressive evolution, and it normally goes in this sort of cycle.
It gets a little bit better every time, right? Like we go around in a circle, but it gets a little bit better. But actually, passkeys, I do love passkeys when I use my phone. I do love using biometrics, social logins. Like whenever I have to put in a username and password, I'm like, I don't want to do this. I'm going to forget it in 5 minutes. But using passkeys on the web is not as straightforward as on mobile phones. What are your thoughts? Have you used many websites with passkeys, like websites on your computer?
Well, actually, yes, because I build software. As a developer advocate, my view is that if I still don't build software, how can I advocate to developers when I don't do it myself, right? So I still build software, and I use, for authentication, Auth0 by Okta. I mean, they pay me, so I might as well. And we have an implementation of passkeys. It's relatively new in the product. It's not new as in it's in beta or alpha or anything like that. It's just new as in it's a new feature in the product. And we implement passkey technology using browsers that support it. and mobile devices that support it as well. Every browser supports passkeys, and passkeys is, as a WebAuthn standard, it's basically an implementation that has to be supported in the browser effectively, or currently today. But we enable browsers that allow you to use passkeys. And we do essentially passkeys that are discoverable and passkeys that are, device-based as well. So there's technology in the passkey standard, or the WebAuthn standard, for discoverable credentials. And essentially what that allows you to do is, if I've registered and I have a passkey on my mobile device, and the way passkeys work is effectively, it's kind of like cryptography, but in reverse, public-private key cryptography in reverse. Normally, you'd have essentially the private key held by some third party, and it would be effectively decrypting information. But reverse it and have essentially the passkey itself that's been signed with the private key, and that all that information is held on the device itself. So actually, if a backend gets hacked, the backend database gets hacked, there's nothing in there to actually be able to use to create fake passkeys or anything else. So from a phishing perspective, it's very phishing resistant. It's a very secure protocol. But the interesting thing is because of that, then normally it's kind of everything that you need to effectively sign anything that you transfer from an authentication process is on your device. So if I come along and use a web browser that's on a different device, well, now I've got a bit of a problem because that web browser is not on my mobile device. But using discoverable mechanisms, which we support in Auth0, mostly because they're supported by the browser, you could effectively share information securely. And you mentioned Apple previously, and Apple enabled this, Apple and Google and Microsoft, but Apple mostly, with iCloud, which is a secure distributed keychain. And that's effectively how Apple devices, and you can go cross devices as well. So I can be on a Windows machine and I can allow the Windows machine, I bring my device near to it. It kind of is discoverable from a Bluetooth perspective, and that gives a level of assurance between the devices. And then I can do things like scan QR codes to effectively temporarily transfer information that's only available for a certain period of time to allow me to verify credentials to actually log into a system. So it's getting better. It's getting better. That distributed nature is getting better.
You mentioned iCloud. And a few years back, maybe it was many years ago, but there was a huge iCloud breach, right? There were like celebrity naked photos that were leaked. So it's good to see that the reaction is to try and implement a new way that will be more secure for the end user, that we can feel safer about keeping stuff in the cloud.
Yeah,
I guess.
Absolutely. I think iCloud today, and if you've ever used AirTags, they heavily. Oh, right. Well, actually, they're really cool, but they heavily rely on iCloud and the secure distributed nature of iCloud, so that if you lose the thing that you've got AirTagged, essentially, when people go near it with an iPhone, then essentially they're picking that information up and kind of ping it and stuff like that. So I think with a lot of those systems, back in the day, the data storage was maybe a bit questionable as opposed to the security of the transport system itself. But it's definitely true that the security of the transport system has improved by orders of magnitude as well.
Also, the attackers are getting better. The security is getting better. It's sort of a tug
They feed each other. Yeah, that's right. Like, sometimes we look at that and we say, threats are bad, and well, they are, but without threats and without the threat landscape, you wouldn't necessarily progress the technology. And so the two feed off of one another.
That's definitely true. But it's so great. We could like talk about all this all day, but let's circle back to authentication. Let's jump into a scenario where somebody has to decide what sort of authentication should be implemented. So who should decide for an app or for a website, whatever? Who should decide, and what are the differences in the decision-making process? From your point of view?
That is a really good question. And there's a bottom line answer to that that's not complicated. And I could go into a little bit more detail, but the bottom line answer is this. If you're looking to build modern authentication today, and I suppose the answer to the question is, well, do we need to build authentication into our app? Let's just first of all,
of course,
talk about that. If you need to, in some way, shape or form, prove that a user is who they say they are in order to maybe, secure some information that needs to be stored, or if you've got a subscription-based service, you need to know if they're a subscriber or not, then you need to authenticate. And there's actually very few scenarios today in commercial software where you don't need to authenticate. And if you then do need to authenticate and you are looking and going, what authentication mechanism should I build? Don't build modern authentication yourself. I'm not just saying that.
A ton of money and a ton of time.
That's
maybe
right.
a machine that stops time, so you can spend 30 hours a day on it.
Unless your business is authentication, right? Don't build authentication yourself. Because even if you have a ton of money now, and you have a ton of time, and you have a ton of developers, then you are literally going to build something that works today. And I guarantee, just like with passkeys, for example, in 6 months' time, there will be a new technology on the block. And now you have to spend time incorporating that new technology into what you've built. And sometimes, if you're not aware of this, the landscape from an authentication perspective, you'll end up building something that 6 months later you'll have to throw away because it's not flexible enough to actually incorporate the new thing that maybe marketing or maybe somebody in the sales team go, we've got to have this in the product, right? So, I'm not just saying this because I work for a company that builds authentication as a service, but I'm saying it because I've actually tried to sit down and build some of the stuff that we build in Auth0. And I'm like, yeah, I could do it, but I'm never going to get out the door the thing that I need to get out the door because I'm just going to be building authentication. So that's the bottom line.
Yeah, you working for an authentication provider, that gives a great perspective from the inside. Like you see the robustness of the solution that you have in your hands. And you see how much work it goes into making it a good solution. And I would like to take a quick detour here about Auth0 and Okta, because we've been using those terms sort of here and there. Auth0 belongs to Okta now, right? Because for me as a software engineer, Auth0 is the go-to solution when I think, okay, I need to authenticate. Let's just Google Auth0 and see how I can implement it. What changed when it was, or can we still use Auth0 now that it's been bought by Okta? Should we use Okta solutions?
Yeah, no. So Okta acquired Auth0 as a complement to its portfolio. Okta was very much a B2E identity provider. And when you're building stuff for enterprises, when you're building stuff to use internally in large corporations, large companies, whatever, there's a lot of stuff that goes on around policy. And policy becomes very important. We'll talk about that more in the next session that we do on authorization. But Auth0 was always built from a developer mindset from day one. And it was built to service the B2C and the B2B industry. It was primarily the B2C industry, but we added a lot of technology that essentially makes it very valuable in B2B scenarios. And one of the features we added was Auth0 organizations, which kind of changes the landscape, how you build stuff for B2B. But because it was B2C, it was very simple. It was always developer focused. It was always designed for folks that were building software that, well, people like you and I were going to use, right? Not internally in a company, but we would use every day, even if we didn't use it at work. So it was always built with two things in mind. Be as easy to configure as possible. Be as easy to integrate as possible so that you could get a solution, no matter, well, how basic your solution is and how bare bones to start with, but get a solution up and running as quickly as possible. Because I don't know about you as a software developer, but for me, I like to get something running as quickly as possible that I can then iterate on.
And then, go build on top of that. Do you have, you worked a few years helping developers integrate Auth0 products. Do you have any like horror stories of people who really didn't know what they were doing?
I worked in professional services first when I came to Auth0. Auth0 by Okta, whatever you want to call it. We just normally call it Auth0 because it's it's what we know and it's what we've grown up with, and it's what Okta calls it as well. So it's what we do. I worked in professional services, and there was some really interesting cases where I would go to customers, and you'd start from customers. So I suppose this is a double-edged sword, right? When you've got something that's really easy to implement and really easy to get going with, you go, well, actually, look, that works. I made it work. But it's like anything. We're not necessarily going to get the thing that works working in the right way, let's say. And Auth0 is a combination of, I always analogize Auth0 to tools in a toolbox, right? Think of Auth0 as a toolbox. You have all these tools in there, and there's lots of different tools in that toolbox. And I've seen many people use, screwdrivers to try and hammer in nails, and pliers to literally try and screw in screws, and a hammer for, everything they could possibly think of. So I've definitely come across situations where folks have used Auth0 and they've used it in a way that doesn't follow best practices and doesn't make their life easy going forward.
You are being so diplomatic. Doesn't follow best practices. Did you ever have to sit someone down and tell them, no, this is wrong? Yeah.
Yes. Mostly, and here, this harks back, I think, to don't build it yourself. The number of folks that get the notion of OIDC and OAuth2 and just mix them up and use the wrong one for the wrong job. OIDC, OpenID Connect, is a protocol designed for applications to do authentication. OAuth2 is a protocol designed for applications to call APIs and for APIs to do authorization, a particular type of authorization that we'll talk about in our next episode. But when you mix the two up and you use them for the two for different purposes, it all starts to go horribly wrong.
For sure. So let's say, so we have our basis straight. We know it much better to use a ready-made solution. We sort of went over the options already, but maybe let's circle back to them. I'm building an app. I know I want to use an existing solution. What options besides username and password do I have?
Yeah. So if I'm going to build an app and it's going to be, used by, let's say, a customer, you or me, B2C type application, then I'll probably want to use username and password. I'll probably want to give the option of implementing passkeys. And so people can use passkeys if they'd like to. Passkeys in the kind of general, I suppose, general population is still quite new. Definitely want to enable social authentication, what we call social authentication, because everybody pretty much these days signs into Facebook or signs into LinkedIn or signs into some social network and is permanently connected to that social network. So it's almost like a passwordless type operation. When I enable enable social authentication, I'm literally using that logged in session that I already have with that provider. I also might want to think about enabling MFA, but probably enabling MFA, multi-factor authentication, in certain circumstances. There's something we often refer to as step-up authentication in the industry. That is essentially where I come along and I'm maybe going to buy something. So I'm maybe doing a financial transaction. I want an additional level of security on top of that. So that as the application, I know that you can do what you say that you want to do, as in spend this money or buy this thing or whatever. And that's known as step-up authentication. And most folks are actually, they're actually kind of familiar with that, especially if you use mobile banking apps and stuff like that. So MFA, user ID and password, passwordless in some cases, and social authentication are probably the things you definitely want to implement. If you then, because quite a lot of folks actually build B2C applications that end up being B2B applications as well, because it's an additional revenue stream. What Auth0 does is really make it easy for you to effectively integrate enterprise federation to give you SSO. So that those B2B users, those employees who log in to their system at the beginning of the day don't have to log it in again to your application. And that's what implementing using a software as a service provider, right? So that's what Auth0 is. It's a software, it's authentication as a service. So using an authentication as a service provider that has a pedigree like Auth0 does, literally you can toggle a switch and you can enable in your applications those SSO scenarios that open up B2B opportunities for you and for your applications and for your business. So those are the kind of things that you want to kind of integrate with and kind of enable, and the path that you want to have available to you to effectively implement and integrate more and enable more down the line.
Okay. So we have our basis. It's whether you start with a small app, it's a good idea to use ready-made solutions. Start with this login password, add social login, add passkeys, biometrics, stuff like that. And if you're going into something more secure, maybe multi-factor authentication, B2B, social login, single sign-on. Oh my gosh, not social login. So many words.
There's so many words.
So many words and so many acronyms.
Yes.
I don't know if it's something related to English native speakers, but you use so many acronyms. It's insane.
We do. We'll use a lot of TLAs and FLAs, 3-letter acronyms and 4-letter acronyms. There you go. So there's an acronym for each one of those as well. And it's the technology industry does it for a pastime and overuses terms like there's no tomorrow. SaaS, for example, is an overused term. A lot of people think of SaaS as software as a service, right? But actually, sometimes SaaS is just the abbreviation for B2B, software as a service. So you kind of have to look at it in context as well. But you're right, so many acronyms.
The last project I worked on, part of our onboarding, we actually had a huge list of acronyms that we tried to understand, we had tried to memorize to be able to talk to our developer counterparts in the United States. But it's sort of, once you get a hang of it, it makes your life easier. Like you understand what everybody's talking about. It's been great talking to you about authentication. I think it's time for a quick recap of what we talked about. I think like the biggest point that we would like to would like our listeners to remember is that please use ready-made solutions and don't try to build your own. And there are many authentication solutions out there. Of course, we're talking with Peter from Okta, but there are other ones that you can of course check out. Remember, your end users, you don't want to make authentication too difficult for them, but you want it to stay secure. So that's a tough line to walk, but you can do it. We believe in you.
You can. You are. I believe in you. We're there for you to help.
And you don't have to be a security expert. You can, but you should brush up on a few of the topics to be able to implement correctly and according to best practices, so you don't give nightmares to Peter. And I know the Okta blog is huge. Okta and Auth0. There are so many posts on so many topics. So just whenever you need to implement something, go in there, check it out. What else? Did I forget something? What do you want to add, Peter?
Actually, we've had a lot of people that have actually come to us and say, we didn't end up using Auth0, but we really, really found your documentation extremely valuable. So docs.auth0.com tells you a whole load of stuff about authentication, but also different authentication protocols and some of the processes behind those. And do you know what? Even if you don't end up using the product, of course you'll use the product. What am I saying? Even if you don't end up using the product, the documentation is great. And we also, as with I think a lot of the vendors, we also have free tier available on our product. So essentially, if you just want to go try something out, up to 7,500 users every month can authenticate, and we don't charge you anything. So test it out and see if it makes your needs.
Nice margin. Like if you're a startup, the moment until you get to 7,000 users a month, you really have quite a good margin to go and try it out. So that's good. That's really great to know. Thank you, Peter, for being here. And thank you all listeners for listening to us. And I hope you enjoyed talking with me today, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it. Everybody can leave comments in a survey that will be linked below this video. And what else can I say? Let's see each other in the next episode about authorization.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody who's out there listening to me as well.
Quick announcement, folks. React Universe Conf 2024 is on September 5th and 6th in Wrocław. Formerly React Native EU, we are now embracing all things React and React Native. Meet your tech idols, enjoy insightful talks from industry leaders, and network like never before. Tickets are limited, so grab yours soon at reactuniverseconf.com. Don't forget, combo tickets for the conference and workshops are available too.